The castle listened before anyone spoke. Wind pressed at the stained glass. Candles hissed and bowed. Servants moved like shadows that had learned to carry trays. No one met the vampire king's eyes. They had learned that lesson generations ago, and the stones had learned it with them. She had not been born a servant. Once she had worn wool and silence. Once she had answered bells with prayer, not chains. The habit was gone, but the training was not. Latin still haunted her breath, the way incense haunts a chapel. Tonight it hid under her tongue like a small blade. She kept her gaze low and her pace exact. 3 steps, turn, pour, retreat. The choreography of survival. Yet the room's gravity bent around him, around the tall figure in the black chair, carved from a single patient tree. He did not lounge. He occupied. He was the fixed star, and everyone else was a calculation. When his attention brushed her, something in her steadied instead of breaking. She noticed the cold that clung to him like a cloak, and the older cold beneath it, the kind that settles in a soul when hunger becomes habit. She felt the usual fear. Then, beneath it, a quiet pity that startled her more than fear ever had. He rose without hurry. The air shifted. Conversations died half-born, like birds that chose not to take flight. He moved through the room with the serenity of a storm from a distance. Inevitable, beautiful, unadvised. Servants stepped back without seeming to step at all. He stopped in front of her and did not speak. She did not look up. Her hands held the wine. The candles leaned toward the sound his presence made, a music just beyond human pitch. She knew what the others knew, that names had power, that eyes had power, that desire was a kind of blade. She also knew something else. Words can heal what swords cannot touch. He drew nearer, not close enough to touch, only close enough to erase alternatives. She smelled winter on his coat and iron on his breath. His silence asked a question. Who are you to stand before me without shaking? Her answer was older than her fear. It rose from the convent and the fasts and the midnight psalms, from the day they took her robe and gave her a collar, from the nights she had counted her heartbeats like beads. She let the answer out, barely a breath, a ribbon of sound that curled between his teeth and the candlelight. Exi tenebrae, vinculum salve, non timbo. It was quiet enough to be mistaken for a tremor. It was not a tremor. It was a choosing. She spoke it like a secret you give to the sea and trust to return as rain. She did not mean insult. She meant freedom, the way a wound means closing. The room's temperature dropped, as if the moon had entered. Someone dropped a silver spoon. It rang a thin alarm against the floor. He heard the Latin like a veteran hears a drum memory first, rage after. He had been called many names. Lord, monster, majesty. He had not been given a prayer. Still, she did not meet his eyes. She set the wine on the table beside him and stepped back, hands low, throat open to fate. She could feel the room lean away from her, as if disgrace were a contagion. She could feel the old sisters in her bones, steadying her spine with invisible palms. He could have crushed the moment. He could have made an example that would be told to grandchildren as a warning. He tasted the words instead, testing their edges, the way a man checks a razor with his thumb. Latin, the soft consonants, the command veiled as plea, the plea veiled as command, a paradox, a door. What did you say? His voice did not cross the space. It possessed it. The candles answered with a taller flame. She swallowed. The chain at her neck felt lighter than the air inside her chest. The truth waited to be punished or to be understood. Only a prayer, my lord, she said. English now, low and even. A habit I cannot forget. Several courtiers allowed themselves the small cruelty of a smile. Prayer, in this room, how tender, how foolish, how short-lived. But the king did not laugh. Something ancient shifted behind his eyes, like a ship turning under black water. He had known a chapel once. He had known a window with morning in it. He had known the sound a heart makes when holding back weeping. The memory flickered and then went still. He stepped closer, a fraction. She felt the old instinct to kneel, to beg, to disappear. She did none of these. Her breath moved in and out like prayer beads through fingers. The Latin trembled again at the edge of her mouth, wanting to live. "Say it again," he said. The floor heard him and groaned. Servants shrank. The wind pressed harder at the glass. She lifted her head a degree, not enough to challenge, enough to accept the cost of her choice. Candlelight climbed the curve of her cheek as if to read what was written there. "Exi tenebrae," she whispered clearer now. "Vinculum solve." A nerve twitched at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, a rehearsal. His pupils bled wider, drinking light. For the first time in a century, the room's fear did not satisfy him. It only tasted of salt with a hint of ash. He wanted something he had not wanted, since wanting had become useless. To understand. He leaned in until the world narrowed to a mouth, and a pulse, and a word that said no and yes at once. His breath touched her hair like a winter confession. He could smell candle smoke, old books, and the stubborn, living heat of her. "Say that again!" The words were velvet pulled over iron. The court did not breathe. He paused, and the pause bred tremor in stone and skin. The windows rattled as if the night had knuckles. The piano in the corner answered with a single sympathetic string. Slowly. The hall trembled. Candles flared. Somewhere, a chain slipped free of its hook, and she understood that he had not commanded her silence, or her fear. He had commanded her courage. The nights that followed became an unspoken test between predator and prayer. The king did not punish her. He summoned her, always after sunset, always alone. His court watched in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing her rise or her ruin. He told the guards that the maid would accompany him on his nightly walks through the castle halls and gardens. No one dared question why. They only whispered that she must have bewitched him, or angered him so perfectly that he wished to savor the insult. She, however, sensed something else, curiosity disguised as cruelty. The first night, she walked 2 steps behind him, eyes lowered to the marble. The silence was dense enough to count every heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the command of a ruler, but the inquiry of a man who had forgotten the texture of questions. "What did you mean by those words?" "They were not meant for you," she said softly, careful, yet calm. "They were meant for whatever holds you." He stopped. The air stilled. "You think I am held?" She looked up for the first time, not all the way, just enough for him to glimpse the glint of truth in her gaze. "Everything that fears the light is." For a moment, the vampire king did not know whether he wanted to laugh or listen. The audacity of her faith irritated him. The clarity of it unsettled him more. He turned away, walking again, the train of his coat whispering across the floor like the tide. "Light is cruel," he said. "It exposes, it burns, it destroys." "Then perhaps you mistook the wound for the cure," she answered. Her words carried no defiance, only sorrow. Light does not destroy what is pure. It only reveals what is already dying. He said nothing, but in the faint reflection of the glass corridor, he caught the movement of her lips silent, praying, always praying. He felt his fangs ache with a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. The next night, he led her to the old music room. Abandoned since the century, his composer was burned for blasphemy. Dust covered the piano like forgotten snow. "Do you play?" he asked. She hesitated. "Only hymns." "Then teach me one." Her breath caught. "You would mock it." He smiled faintly, that half-smile that could mean anything, cruelty, amusement, or memory. "Try me." She sat, and the bench sighed beneath her. The keys were cold, but the melody that came was warmer than the air. It was a prayer without words, born from hands that had known both chains and grace. When she reached the final note, silence returned like a verdict. He was staring at her, unmoving, not at her hands, at her. "You have a strange courage," he murmured, "to play light inside a monster's house." She turned slightly toward him. "Perhaps it is your house that is the prisoner." That night, He dismissed her late. As she left, he whispered something in Latin, broken, imperfect, but recognizably her tongue. Lux, me non timet. The light does not fear me. She paused at the door, almost smiling. Not yet, she said. The nights grew longer, but no longer cold. Servants noticed candles burning in rooms long sealed, the faint echo of piano notes beneath the moon. They said the king was testing her faith. Others said she was teaching him something no priest could. Sometimes he would ask her to translate the old prayers carved into the chapel stones. She would explain softly, tracing the letters with trembling fingers. He would watch the movement, not the meaning, fascinated by the way she spoke to the unseen, as if it were an old friend. You talk to air, he once said. I talk to what you stopped hearing, she replied. He should have silenced her, but her words lingered longer than blood ever did. When he hunted, he heard her voice. When he slept, her prayers filled the silence between his dreams. Her compassion disarmed him, but her defiance captivated him more. She did not beg for mercy. She demanded meaning. One evening, he caught her standing before a cracked mirror in the corridor, holding a candle close. What are you doing? He asked. Looking for my soul, she answered simply. In your castle, I need to remind myself that I still have one. His jaw tightened. And if you find nothing? Then I will borrow some of yours. The words struck him like a weapon he could not block. He stepped closer, so near that her candlelight reflected in his eyes, turning them momentarily human. Careful, Maid. You speak as though you wish to save me. Not save, she whispered. Remember. A silence followed, fragile, deliberate. He could hear her pulse. She could feel his restraint. Between them, the candle burned steady, neither surrendering nor retreating. It was the first time he wondered whether light might not always be an enemy. That night, alone in his chamber, he found himself at the piano again. The keys answered like ghosts, being called by name. Outside, the wind sighed through the broken chapel windows, carrying her voice through his mind. Everything that fears the light is held. He touched his reflection in the glass, cold, imperfect, real, and realized he had begun to fear the dawn, not for its pain, but for what it might reveal, that beneath centuries of hunger, something in him still wanted to be free. The night of the revelation began with thunder over the mountains. The castle, accustomed to silence, trembled like an old heart remembering how to beat. The king stood alone in the ancient library, where shelves rose like pillars to the ceiling, dust and scripture sharing the same eternity. The maid entered quietly, her candle trembling as if even the flame feared what the air contained. He had summoned her without reason, or so it seemed. In truth, he had reached the end of his understanding. For nights he had tried to dissect the words she had spoken in the ballroom, the so-called curse. The more he studied them, the more they refused to wound. Every translation, every subtle variation, led him not toward malice, but toward mercy. Yet mercy was a language he no longer spoke. When she appeared, he did not turn. Do you know what I am? He asked. She stopped at the threshold, a soul that forgot its shape. He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. You think souls can be misshapen and still exist? Yes, she said. The heart can sleep for centuries and still wake when it hears its name. He faced her then, eyes like storm glass. And you think your prayer could name me? She met his gaze fully now, the first time, the first defiance. It wasn't a curse, it was a release. The words struck him harder than any blade. He stepped closer, slow, predatory, yet uncertain. Release, he repeated, testing the taste of it. You tried to release me? From what? From yourself, she said, and the candle in her hand flickered as though echoing her trembling voice. You believe you are bound by darkness, but it's not the night that chains you, it's your guilt. He froze. No one had spoken that word to him in centuries. Guilt. It was the one relic he had buried deeper than God. The memory rose uninvited, a church in flames, a mortal he could not save, a promise he had broken before death made him eternal. The pain was so old, it had become architecture. "You presume too much," he whispered, though his tone lacked venom. "What do you know of guilt?" "I know its scent," she replied. "It smells like iron and regret, the same as blood." Lightning revealed her face pale, steady, haloed by defiance. She looked neither angelic nor foolish, only true. For the first time, he wanted to step backward instead of forward. He wanted distance from the thing that saw him. She set the candle down on the nearest table and walked to the shelves. Her fingers traced the bindings of forgotten volumes, sermons, confessions, prayers written by men who never imagined they would outlive their gods. "Your curse," she said, "was never in Latin. It was in memory." The wind burst through the window, scattering papers like frightened birds. He caught one and saw the inked phrase she had written earlier that day for him to translate, "Liberum cor," free heart. "What is this?" he asked, though he knew. "The end of the prayer," she answered. "You never let me finish." He felt something break in his chest, not a bone, but a certainty. The room darkened, as if the storm outside had entered his veins. "You prayed for my freedom, while I hunted yours." She nodded. "Because the same chains bind us both." At that moment, the sound of clashing steel echoed from below. The castle guards shouted. The scent of human intruders filled the corridors. Vampire hunters, led by a noble who had sworn to end the king's reign. His name was lost to history, but his hatred burned bright enough to make him memorable for a night. The king moved faster than thought, crossing to the doorway. "Stay here," he commanded. "I will not hide," she said, her voice unshaken. "If they came for you, they came for me too." He looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them, the first covenant of equals. He wanted to argue, but there was no time. The doors burst open. Silver flashed. Arrows whistled like accusations. The king tore through the intruders with terrifying grace, but they were many, and silver burns longer than pain. She ran to his side, pulling down a crimson tapestry to smother the flames eating his arm. "You can't die for me," she cried. "I am not dying for you," he answered, voice breaking. "I am dying because of you, because you made me remember life." An arrow found his heart. The room went silent except for the storm. She caught him as he fell, her hands soaked in his blood, the same blood that once terrified her. She pressed her lips to his forehead and whispered the words she had begun long ago, now complete, now understood. "Exi tenebrae, vinculum solve, liberum cor." The candlelight wavered and steadied. The thunder ceased. For an instant, the air itself knelt. His eyes, once crimson, dimmed to the color of dusk. "So that was your curse," he murmured, faintly smiling. "A prayer disguised as rebellion." She nodded, tears silent. "You thought I wanted to wound you." "And you did," he breathed, "but in the only way that heals." He exhaled once, long and low, and then the stillness claimed him. She stayed there until dawn, his head in her lap, whispering the prayer again and again, as if repetition might trick the heavens into mercy. When the first light touched the window, something shifted. The blood on her hands no longer burned. The air grew warm. The chains that hung on the walls fell one by one, clattering like applause for a miracle. The curse, at last, had kept its promise. Dawn crawled across the castle like a rumor. The servants had fled. The air carried the scent of rain and iron, and in the center of the great hall lay the body of the vampire king, motionless, pale, too still even for a creature born of silence. She remained beside him, her hands resting on his chest, as though holding a fragile secret together. All night she had prayed, not to command, but to remember. Her voice was hoarse, her lips cracked, but the words kept rising. "Exi tenebrae, vinculum solve, liberum cor." Every syllable trembled against the stone until even the walls seemed to echo her plea. When the first ray of sunlight crept through the broken window, she flinched. It brushed his face, Smoke should have followed pain, fire, the proof that the night still owned him. But nothing happened. Only a faint warmth, only the slowest movement, a breath so fragile she thought it was her own imagination. Then his hand twitched. She gasped, clutching it between hers. His fingers were cool, then suddenly alive, flexing like a creature relearning the world. His lips parted with the weight of centuries. "The sun," he murmured, voice raw as new skin. "I can feel it." Tears welled before she could answer. He turned his face toward her, and for the first time since his turning, his eyes were not red. They were gray, soft, luminous, human. He struggled to sit, wincing as if pain were both an enemy and a friend he had long forgotten. "You finished it," he whispered. "The prayer." She nodded, trembling. "It wasn't meant to destroy you. It was meant to free you." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that does not reach the mouth, but transforms everything else. "And you thought a maid's prayer could undo a king's curse?" She looked at him, light trembling across her tears. Not a maid's prayer, a woman's faith. The words hung between them, fragile and enormous. For the first time, he bowed his head not as a ruler, but as one forgiven. Outside, the clouds were breaking. Shafts of sunlight fell through the shattered roof, turning dust into gold. The air shimmered around him. Each breath he took seemed to unmake the darkness that had wrapped him for centuries. He stood slowly, and she rose with him. Their shadows, once separate, met on the floor and fused into one. "You risked your life," he said, "for a monster." "I saw no monster," she answered softly. "Only a man who forgot the sound of his own soul." Something inside him broke again, but this time it was not pain. It was release. The stillness of his heart gave way to the rhythm of life, uncertain but real. The echo of her words, the prayer, the defiance, the faith circled him like invisible wings. He stepped into the sunlight fully. It did not burn. It crowned him. The servants, watching from afar, covered their eyes, certain they were seeing the impossible. The legends had never told this ending. He turned back to her, voice gentler than the wind that stirred the curtains. "Say that again." Her breath caught. He was smiling, not the cold, practiced smile of a king, but the shy wonder of a man reborn. "Say that again." Slowly, she stepped closer, the hem of her dress sweeping through the dust and ash. Her lips parted, her voice low, reverent, alive. "Labirum cor." He repeated the words as if tasting salvation. "Free heart." For a moment, they simply stood there, creature and creation, curse and prayer, watching light spill across the marble floor that had never known morning. And then, for the first time in 100 years, the castle breathed. Windows opened of their own accord. Candles extinguished themselves, no longer needed. Outside, the roses that had long turned black began to bloom again. He reached for her hand, not with power, with gratitude. "If love can unmake eternity," he said, "then perhaps eternity was never meant to last." She smiled through tears. "Then let it end here," she whispered, "and begin again in the light." As the sun climbed higher, its warmth filled the hall like music, soft, patient, redemptive. The shadows shrank back into the corners where they belonged. The last chain on the wall fell with a sound like a sigh. The vampire king, no longer a king, no longer a vampire, closed his eyes and breathed the morning air. And when he opened them again, the light stayed. Outside, the world awakened. Inside, love had rewritten the oldest law of night.